So massively unexpected news today that Games Workshop seem to have made their latest Space Marine release just a little bit overpowered. When all of the top 4 lists at a massive grand tournament are running Primaris Desolation Squads, it might just be a soft sign that something's up. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and today I thought it was worth another quick video on the Desolation Squad. Now there's been some major tournaments with people using them, and certainly in one of them, the Manchester GT, they seem to have absolutely dominated. Let's talk about the unit, what they do, and how these top competitive players and lists are putting them on the board. Now it's only been a few weeks since Games Workshop has invited us all to buy the new Primaris game Desolation Squad. These guys are the kind of Primaris Devastator equivalents. They've got a direct fire missile launcher that most people want to take the anti-vehicle one of, and then a whole bunch of anti-infantry shots that they can fire out of line of sight. When the stats dropped for these guys, most people's reactions seem to be pretty meh, but as often seems to be the case with barrage weapons, particularly ones that are core and can get some big buffs, it does appear that they can be a tournament-stomping component of strong Space Marine armies, particularly ones of Dark Angels and Iron Hands. Here's their unit profile. The Desolation Marines are 35 points each, basically have the profile of a standard intercessor. Generally people like to take the Super Crack missile launcher with a big anti-tank shot, 48-inch range with strength 8, AP 3 and damage D3 plus 3. That's backed up by a Castellan launcher with D3 shots at strength 4, AP minus 1 and ignores line of sight. And on the Sergeant it usually makes sense to take the Vengor launcher, 10 points extra to trade out the Super Crack, but that gives you a seriously bitey ignores line of sight weapon, D6 shots at strength 6, AP minus 1 and damage 2, kinda similar to the Space Marine Whirlwind in stat lines, but on a single infantry model. The Vengor launcher also gets a +1 to hit from targeter optics, and you can get a further +1 to hit beyond that with the Sergeant's Signum, meaning that this thing could be hitting on 2s despite the barrage penalty. Overall, I would rate them as very expensive for the defensive profile, 185 points for 5 of them with the Vengor launcher. If your opponent can damage them, then it's going to be bad news. And then beyond that, they kind of dual proposition fire support, anti-infantry barrage and the Vengor launcher to hurt enemy elites a little bit, and then direct fire anti-tank damage. Potentially you could have a few turns of firing out of line of sight before choosing the right moment to step up into line of sight and blast some tanks dead with the direct fire super cracks. You could potentially play them a bit differently depending on the enemy army that you're playing as well. Against certain armies that matter, just go very heavy on the barrage fire and just don't care about the super cracks. Whereas for enemies that you don't really have any decent ignores line of sight targets, you could just lean into the direct fire. Sure, they might be a little bit expensive for the job, but they're definitely not going to be wasted in that matchup either. It does seem that at the moment they are very viable indeed in top Space Marine lists. I was actually inspired to talk about them again as I saw a post on the competitive 40k Reddit page, just casually noting that all 4 of the top lists in the Manchester Grand Tournament with 240 plus players all had a significant amount of Desolation Marines. The least used was 8 and the most used was 20. It's kind of surprising in the first place that the top 4 were all Marines, but the fact that they were all Marines using this unit is kind of interesting. Shows that they're absolutely top tier in the current meta, maybe auto-include for Space Marines, at least while Permanent Devastator Doctrine exists, and the enemy armies that they're likely to be fighting have some good targets for the barrage weapons. Out of the 2 firing modes, I would say that the ignores line of sight is by far the most important bit. Other Space Marine units can do anti-tank duty pretty well, things like Las Cannon Devastators or Eradicators perhaps, so ignores line of sight kind of is the main selling point for the unit. If you throw in a Vengor launcher and 5 Castellan launchers, all firing out of line of sight, taking the barrage penalty, and the Sergeant using the Signum on himself, this is the sort of damage output that you could expect. A squad of 5 really does go through hordes really quite quickly, 6 or 7 dead guardsmen, assuming that there's 10 models in the unit and they trigger the blast keyword, and then it's mainly chip damage against the other things, but still kinda significant, 1 or 2 dead marines, almost a dead Terminator, and a bit of chip damage to a toughness 7 vehicle. Definitely not super effective against those kind of targets, but you could do a turn or 2 of that, and then step into line of sight, and blast them with the super cracks as well, and hopefully make up the rest of the damage that you need to. In reality, I think the numbers for these would actually be a fair bit better. If you're playing either Dark Angels or Iron Hands, you get better damage output, as we'll talk about, plus they're a unit that you can really easily get character rerolls for as well, with either Captains, Lieutenants or Chapter Masters. Currently, out of some of the top lists in Warhammer 40k, they really have quite a lot of good meta targets. The Vengor launcher is very dangerous, but in particular the Castellans will be very savage against the toughness 3 and toughness 4 infantry. There really are quite a lot of armies that rely on good units of those that hide behind terrain to stay safe, and the Desolation Squads can be quite a good counter to them. Guard in particular would absolutely hate to see these on the other side of the table. You could tear a massive chunk out of a Barbican's Key Catacomb unit potentially before it even jumped. These guys will go through mortars very quickly that tend to be a pretty helpful ignores line of sight firepower choice for the Guard themselves. For the Genestealer cults who have been making waves recently, basically any units will be good targets for these. Particularly pure strain Genestealers and Acolytes might be great ones to go for. Anything out of the various flavours of Eldari won't like the Desolation Marines. Strength 4 attacks are excellent for Inari Craftworlds and Harlequins, and even other armies like Demons and Orcs, which they might not be as efficient against, are still armies that they don't want to get hit by volume fire at low AP on the units that matter the most. Finally, even against certain tougher armies, you might well just be able to snipe down a weak objective camping unit, which could be enormously disruptive. Lots of people like to throw a cheap objective holder on their home objective, say some Sisters of Silence for Custodes, Chaos Cultists, or any other cheap low investment units to sit on a home field objective. If it gets sniped down, your opponent might need to commit something more important to holding that point. You generally can't afford to just let your home field objective just sit around unscored. It means that against a whole load of armies they could be absolutely brutal to face, and even against the ones that they aren't, you could just lean into the super crack missiles a little bit more and just have them be long range direct damage dealers and tear some chunks out of tanks or heavy infantry. Finally, to see how these guys are actually being used in practice, I thought we'd take a look at the rough arrangements that they've been used in the lists, and there are a lot of common choices between all four of them. Literally all of the sergeants take the excellent Vengor launchers, the standard marines take the super crack rather than the super frag, maybe not too unexpected there. And then one choice which I did find kinda interesting was that most of the lists also took a master crafted Vengor launcher using the 1 command point sergeant upgrades to get you +1 damage on one weapon. I must admit I hadn't thought of that when I first saw the units, but it does make sense. It means that in theory all game long you could be chipping away with a d6 shot, strength 6 and damage 3 weapon. You are going to stack some saves with that as you go along, and it means it could genuinely threaten heavy infantry, things with 3 wounds like Terminators or Adeptus Custodes, though they might struggle a bit if they happen to be in cover. The list that went heaviest on them was Manichima's Dark Angels. 3 squads were taken there, 2 units of 5 and 1 unit of 10 with the mastercrafted Vengor, and then that fire support was backing up 2 units of Deathwing Terminators, 2 hovering Talon Masters floating behind them, a few support characters and a couple of scoring Landspeeders. I can imagine that would be a super frustrating list to fight, just a ridiculous amount of firepower that you couldn't target directly, not until you'd slogged through an enormous squad of Deathwing, which isn't exactly the easiest to do. In this sort of list I'd usually expect to see a bunch of Ravenwing fire support instead of the Desolation Squads, so it does look like they're a credible option over them. I think just based on their raw stats, quite a lot of people worked out that they'd be very good for the Dark Angels. Often their chapter tactic isn't the most relevant, as most of their stuff wants to be moving, but it's super relevant on these guys, getting a +1 to hit with all of those Castellan launchers, and the army's usually happy to sit in Ravenwing Devastator Doctrine as well, so you'd get the extra AP from that. This was also the list that went on to win the event, so it seems like heavy use of Desolation Squads are viable at the very highest level. Otherwise in the top 4 there were also 2 Iron Hands lists as well. Brian Seep and Inez Wilson both had 2 sets of 5 in their Iron Hands lists. Both were pretty similar, with Devastators, Eradicators, Scouts, a Character Contemptor and some Vanguard veterans, all run in a Master Artisans and Whirlwind of Rage successor. One of them took a Vengor launcher, the other one didn't, and in the list was also a supporting lieutenant that could have been on standby to allow them rerolls to wound if they wanted, meaning that with the Iron Hands Devastator doctrine, each of the squads will be rerolling 1s to hit and 1s to wound, which is going to be a significant damage boost above the numbers that we talked about before. Iron Hands will be particularly nice if they did want to step up and start blasting away direct as well. They could be behind a big line of sight blocking ruin, and then move 6 inches forward and fire their super crack missiles without penalty due to ignoring the heavy weapon penalty, and they'd also get reroll 1s to hit on those as an added bonus. They've got some okay damage and defensive stratagems as well. They can flex into a 5+ feel no pain if it makes sense for the unit, though I guess that'll usually be better used elsewhere. Finally, and rounding out the Desolation Squad parade is Alex Harrison with his Space Wolves. Just the 1 unit in this one unit of 8, and again using that mastercrafted Vengor launcher. These guys had some nice focused fire support alongside Jump Pack Wolfguard and Skyclaws, a bunch of Wolfen and a Chapter Master and Lieutenant, plus a few more Longfang bodies to keep them company in the fire support, with those very nice Terminator pack leaders with the Cyclone launchers. I guess this would probably be a list that would want to make its way towards the Space Wolves Assault Doctrine. There is a whole load of melee in there, but Space Wolves in particular have access to the Keen Senses stratagem, which is quite nice. It allows them to ignore any ballistic skill and to hit roll modifiers, so that would overcome the barrage penalty. Maybe that's the motivation behind there being a slightly bigger unit than normal, to get a bit more efficiency out of that stratagem. In any case, it is kind of interesting when there's this much convergence in terms of using a unit all of a sudden in Space Marine armies. Shows that these guys are very, very good, particularly on more terrain-dense tables, and it's kind of fun to see the different ways that people are using them. So anyway, let me know what you think of Games Workshop's fancy new missile marines, now they've had some chance to prove themselves on the field of battle good and proper. Do you feel that this kind of usage shows that they're overtuned, or are they just one element within a Space Marine army that isn't necessarily worse than the other things? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.